Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest installment from New York Shakespeare. My name is Rodney Hakim. I'm the voice behind the New York Shakespeare social media feeds, where we try to bring you as much as we can as is happening in New York and the surrounding areas relating to Shakespeare, whether that is stage productions, book releases, film screenings, podcasts, or whatever the case might be. We try to bring to you as much Shakespeare content as we can across social media on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, WordPress, and elsewhere. Connect with us, friend us, follow us, do any of the social media things that connect you with us on across social media. Again, New York Shakespeare. Sometimes that's NY Shakespeare, and in one or two locations it's New York Shakespeare, all spelled out. But either way, connect with us for the latest content, the latest happenings in the world of Shakespeare. This past month and for the past several weeks, we have been shining our spotlight on Shakespeare and education. We have been focusing on writers, scholars, educators, teachers, authors, and having them tell us about their journeys with William Shakespeare, with the Bard, and their insights to help us all learn more and to brush up our Shakespeare, so to speak, to borrow a phrase from a famous show of many years ago. So today we are joined by a wonderful scholar, playwright, director, actor, multi-hyphenate, Scott Kaiser. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Rodney. How are you?
I'm good. Good. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And you are speaking to us, and we're expanding our circle just a skosh out of New York. You're way over in Oregon, right?
I live in Ashland, Oregon, and work here. And because my employer for so many years, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, is in some ways considered a national institution in terms of Shakespeare. I think it's perfectly appropriate for you to bring me on.
Yeah, we've spoken about other groups from Oregon on many occasions. We've discussed the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. We discussed the Play On Shakespeare series, among others. There's although it's not New York geographically, there's still a ton of stuff happening over there and a lot of great insights coming out of that organization and from people like yourself. So speaking of Scott Kaiser and Kaiser Shakespeare, let me give the audience who, if you might not be familiar with Scott, let me give you a quick rundown of who Scott is. Scott is a nationally recognized master teacher of acting and voice, as well as a director, playwright, and author. For 28 seasons, Scott served as a member of the artistic staff of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, where he directed, adapted, coached, and performed every play in the Shakespeare canon. Now, that is very impressive, Scott. And you are the author of, I think it's 22 now. You have more than 20 books. I think it's 22.
22 is correct, yeah.
22 is correct, including novels, short stories, instructional guides to acting Shakespeare, and numerous plays and adaptations for the stage. So, Scott, I think in one of the books, I think it's the Tao of Shakespeare. You mentioned that you began your interest, your lifelong love with William Shakespeare at the tender age of 15. Tell us all about it, Scott.
Well, like so many of us, I was in high school, and I was actually working as a technician backstage, hanging lights and building scenery, and they were short a man to play bottom. And so I got recruited by the head of the drama program there at high school and ended up in that role. I don't recall whether I was any good or not in the role, but I certainly got bitten by the bug at that point, and kept going from there. Very early on, I decided I wanted to conquer the entire canon. Even at 15, I wanted to keep going. So I checked Midsummer off my list and just kept going.
Okay. All right. And then, after high school, I'm sure into your college years and subsequent to that, you went further and further in your Shakespeare studies. How did your interest as a student translate into a career in Shakespeare?
Well, I did more Shakespeare as an undergraduate, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle and did more Shakespeare there. While I was in training, I was doing Shakespeare all over the country, places like Georgia and Illinois. A lot of those, those regional Shakespeare festivals that are still quite active, and slowly transitioned from acting to teaching. I taught at Duke University for 3 years, I received a degree at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London, where I learned much more about voice training, voice coaching. And from there, I wound up back at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I spent the next 3 decades essentially working on not just on Shakespeare, but plays going back to the Greeks all the way to plays that were written last week.
Right, right, right. It's spanning the whole continuum, but Shakespeare is prominently featured right in the middle. So Scott, you've had this journey throughout the world, throughout the U.S. And abroad, England and elsewhere, and you've done your studies in Shakespeare. At what point during those studies you learned you got some a little bit deeper into voice instruction and acting instruction? At what point do you become a teacher, and at what point do you become a playwright?
Well, it's not as if it's in any way sequential. It's not a series of dominoes that just fall. One of the things that occurred in my graduate training was my mentor was very much about when a door opens, walk into it, and not to essentially not to specialize and just to do whatever opportunities come to you. So over many decades, I've just spread out with opportunities to playwright or to vocal coach or to work on an artistic staff in terms of casting or directing or acting. Just as doors open, I walked into them. There are people who call me a generalist. I don't think of myself as a generalist, but I feel like I wear a lot of hats and I wear them simultaneously, and I always have. For anybody who wants to work in this industry where opportunity is really hard to come by, that's been a really successful approach for me, which is like, oh yeah, I'll do that. I can do that. And then you develop that skill and you go deeper and deeper along. So it's all essentially simultaneous pursuit of all of the different disciplines and not sequential.
Okay, all right. I feel like we are two halves of the same coin that way. I also I also throughout my years of doing Shakespeare in and around New York, I've worn many hats, and sometimes you're an actor, sometimes you're a director or a producer, whatever the case is, whatever situation arises that you decide, hey, that sounds like an exciting project, but I have to do this to be involved in that. Just so we kind of follow what the flow of things that come our way. Mm-hmm. So you're writing, you're teaching. In your body of work, you have 22 books to your credit. Which of those came first? Was it the novelizations that are riffs on Shakespeare's plays? Is it instructional guides? What was the sequence of those books?
Well, my first book was Mastering Shakespeare, an acting class in 7 scenes, and that was my attempt to codify the approach to Shakespeare for actors that I had been trained and then developed further into my own system. And once I started working with that book, I really got a taste for publishing and writing. So I've been writing ever since. My second book was Shakespeare's Wordcraft, which is a 325-page book that is essentially about rhetorical devices. And although it's published by Limelight, which is a commercial publisher, it's very much written for actors. And what I've done is I've taken out all the Greek and Latin terms and really focused on language patterns. So I've had a lot of scholars criticize the book because I didn't use the scholarly terms that they use in the English department. The book was never intended for the English department or for English literature students or PhDs. It was always intended for theater people and for actors, which is why I stripped those out, because my early observation was that's what pushes people away from the study of rhetoric, which I find essential in terms of how to perform Shakespeare, how to direct Shakespeare. But most actors get turned off when they see the terminology. So I stripped it out of the book. And that's been a very successful book for me as well.
Well, let's put a pin in the discussion of the chronology of your books for a second. I think for me, that's such a great point, and that's something that resonates for me very strongly, is that in the world of Shakespeare teaching or pedagogy or whatever you want to call it, there there are the academic forms of teaching Shakespeare, and they are the practical ways of teaching Shakespeare to actors. And very often those are two entirely different things. And it's great to have someone like yourself find a middle path that uses some of the teaching of the one to inform the other, but doesn't necessarily blanket it in the terminology of the academic world, which can sometimes be limiting or sometimes be frustrating to actors because they don't speak that language, so to speak. It's all English, but much like Shakespearean English to contemporary English, it's a different form of English. So how did you go about? You mentioned stripping out some of the terminology, some of the academic verbiage. How did you go about not dumbing it down, but using actors speak to come to that process?
No, definitely not dumbed down. First and foremost, I've always thought of myself as a practitioner. Although I had a few years at Duke, my entire career has essentially been as a practitioner. Everything I do is in the professional world. I dabble in academia and I teach in academia, but that's not how I consider myself. So when it comes to teaching rhetoric, I teach it as a practitioner. Not as someone who has a doctor or PhD at the end of their name. So when it comes to Shakespeare's figures of speech or rhetoric, I don't ever use terms like epinelepsis or paranomasia. I know that most actors, they'll shut right down when you use that. So I use terms like, oh, did you notice how the language bookends here? Or do you notice how this word is repeated? Or look how we turned a verb into a noun here. And so it's very easy to talk about the patterns of language without using any of the terms. As I said, a lot of scholars have criticized the book or wondered why I didn't put the terms at the back of the book. But for me, because it's really is about inviting actors into this really remarkable world of Shakespeare's wordplay. That taking a practitioner's approach has really been, I think, my way in, thinking the way actors think and not the way someone who's seeking a PhD in English literature is thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember as you're speaking, it brings to mind a certain instance I had when I was directing a show years ago, and I was trying to work with an actor about where to put a pause in a speech, and somehow the conversation derailed into what is a pregnant pause versus what is whatever else. So it's great to have someone who is using the practical language that actors are are conversant in and use that as a way forward. Okay, so you're mastering Shakespeare, you have Shakespeare's wordcraft, and then from there are some of the other ones that come sequentially after that, more of the instructive, or when do you move into your some of your novelizations or your riffs on Shakespeare? You have some great titles. You have Love's Labour's Won. You have Falstaff in Love. You have what's the sequence of how you wrote all those books?
Well, again, the thing about publishing is the sequence you write them in is often not the sequence they're published in because of delays or commercial aspects. So, but yeah, I started to branch out. You mentioned the Tao of Shakespeare, and that's essentially inspirational poetry, where I talk about how Buddhism and Taoism intersect with Shakespeare's words of wisdom throughout the canon and intersect those two things along with contemporary life. So that's something I started writing shortly after Shakespeare's Wordcraft. Then I started to think about the prequels and sequels. So the first sequel I did was Love's Labour's Won, because I got interested in, well, how does Love's Labour's Lost end? And if you know anything about Love's Labour's Lost, most scholars believe that we've lost a play called Love's Labour's Won. It's mentioned in various sources, not a lot, but it's mentioned as a title, and we don't have it. So I just started to think about what might that play look like, and I wrote it the way Shakespeare would have written it. It's in verse. It uses only Shakespeare's vocabulary. If it's not in the concordance, I didn't use the word. And I try to resolve that action in a secondary play, what the sequel would have been. Falstaff in Love was the same impulse. It's like, of course, Queen Elizabeth famously asked Shakespeare to write a play about Shakespeare in love. He wrote Merry Wives of Windsor, which really doesn't show Shakespeare in love. He's a con man in that. So I decided to actually do what Queen Elizabeth asked for and write a young Falstaff who's falling in love for the first time and play through there. I have another play called Shakespeare's Other Women, and I wrote that because in the educational institution down the street, Southern Oregon University, they had an awful lot of women, and it was very hard to put them in a Shakespeare without demanding that you cross-gender cast. So I wrote a play that has 36 female monologues that are all Shakespeare adjacent. So, there's an Anne Boleyn monologue, and there's a Queen Elizabeth monologue, and there's monologues for characters that appear in Shakespeare but don't say much, or are mentioned but don't appear. And I have 36 of those. And that can be done with a cast of 9 women or 12 women or 18 women. It was very much as an educational vehicle. And it's been produced quite a few times, actually, because colleges in particular are always looking for vehicles for young women that don't demand that they play men.
Right. And by the way, I love your usage of the phrase Shakespeare adjacent. I use that all the time. I think you're the only other person aside from myself I've heard use that one. So okay, so you have some of your takes on Shakespeare's plays, and then you have some other things. You hear some other titles. You have Notes from the Back Row and Tales from the Vomitorium. So these these are more in concern of your work as a director, right?
Well, Notes from the Back Row, it's about a very specific season, a 1996 season at the festival. I kept a diary, and then years later I pulled it out and I realized that it was a book. It was the first year for a brand new artistic director in that year, and everything was changing, and there was territoriality in politics, and I was writing about my experience inside that. So I was working as a vocal coach at the time, and so it's very much about my experience coaching Shakespeare, coaching August Wilson, coaching Moliere, and all the directorial angst that comes with directors working in repertory theater with a repertory company. So that's what that book is about. It's literally about sitting in the back row, taking notes, and being blown by tempests for the entire year while people found their way through new leadership. The other book you mentioned, Tales from the Vomitorium, what I did was I wrote a collection of short stories. I think there's 36 in there. So I went to every play by Shakespeare, and I wrote a 5 or 6 page story that was inspired by a Shakespeare play, but it's all completely contemporized and modernized. It's a very dark book, actually. It's about life in the theater, and most of the endings, even the comic endings, are about the struggle to survive in the theater. But it's all rooted in Shakespeare's plays. So looking at Beatrice and Benedick in Much Ado, I asked myself, well, who are they like in a theater context? Well, maybe they're like 2 veteran actors who are or who have been living together, but now they're having problems, So I've kind of drawn on Shakespeare to create these contemporary stories, and one for each play. And it was just a challenge that I set for myself.
Okay, all right, and you have numerous other plays. We can go through all the titles, but you have many more. The ones that are the variations of Shakespeare plays, Love's Labor is one, Falstaff and Love. Some of the other ones have all of them had a production history to them, or are they some of them?
They all have a production history, yes. Many of them had either college productions or graduate school productions, and then went on to usually some form of a professional production somewhere. So they're all produced. And in the front matter, I outline exactly what the production history is of each of those. I also have a large range of educational scripts. What I've done is boiled down quite a few scripts to little over an hour, because I think teachers are often looking for, gee, I really want to teach the Scottish play. I really want to teach Macbeth in my classroom. but I can't find a good adaptation. So I've done quite a few of those, I think 7 or 8 of them, where I offer a 10 or 12 person cast of a 70-minute Macbeth. And those have been used by teachers all over the country, and I think it proved to be very useful in an education setting. Again, as a practitioner, I feel like I'm able to cut those scripts in a way that really can help teachers who, honestly, it's a struggle when you're a high school teacher to spend the time to cut Macbeth down to an hour.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
there are commercially available versions, but many of them aren't cut by practitioners; they're cut by scholars, so they don't really work very well.
Right. That's great. So you have a wide range of texts for the stage, for the classroom, for the audience member over there, for actors who are trying to learn that craft. You have much like your own journey through Shakespeare, where you wore so many hats. The collection of books that you wrote reflects that multiplicity of your journey, and it has multiple uses out there for the different people out there in the audience. So Scott, the books that you wrote, whether it's the ones that are for the stage or the ones for the classroom, typically how long does it take for you to from stage to from I'm sorry from putting the pen to paper or the cursor to the screen? How long does it take you for each of these projects to get from beginning to end?
Well, Shakespeare's Wordcraft, the rhetoric book, that took the longest. The thing that people forget is that if I were working in an academic institution, that I would probably have graduate students to help me do the research and do all the especially the proofing and the collating and the footnotes and all of that. And of course, if I had worked in academia, I could have taken a sabbatical, or I could go to London and look at the Shakespeare Library. That book took me 10 years because collecting the material and collating the material, organizing the material, proofing the material, I was always doing that in the nooks and crannies of my career. And there weren't a lot of nooks and crannies when you're working on 11 shows and rotating rep over the course of a year. So it took me a long time. As I say, people assume it took me a year or two, and yeah, if I'd been a scholar, it would have taken a couple of years. But that one took me 10 years. Some of the other plays and works that I've done, one or two of them were as short as a year. Some of them a couple of years. So a lot of it depends on how much was going on in my life at the time and how much free time I could find. And because I'm a bit of a night owl, I wake up in the middle of the night. Quite a bit of my writing happens at 3 in the morning. I'll get up, I can't sleep. I'll get up, I'll do a couple of hours of writing, and I'll go back to bed. But I would say my answer would be between 1 year and 10 years, depending on the work.
So
Um,
the
yeah.
22 books in your collection that spans pretty much your adult life putting all those together, and it's wonderful that you have such a wide variety of books addressing so many different areas. And if people want to come and check out all the wonderful things that you have put together, the Tao of Shakespeare, all the other ones, there's so many. They can go to Kaiser Shakespeare, right? KaiserShakespeare.com. That's the best location for everything Scott Kaiser.
Yes. There's also I have an Amazon. I mean, there's an Amazon author page. So if it's about a purchase, then that's a great place to go. And I think 21 of the no, they're all listed there on Amazon as well. So if you go to the Scott Kaiser author page on Amazon, they'll be there. But they're all on my website as well. So
Okay.
um, and I think just to double back, Ronnie, I think the theme that really holds my work together is, I think of myself as a practitioner, and as I've gotten older, I really am. I think of myself very much as an educator at this point, and as a mentor to young performers. And I think if you look at all of my work, the common theme is how can I give back? How can I create something that will be useful to someone else? And working as a practitioner in particular, we tend to think of tools, I think, in a way that maybe a lot of academics don't. What do I have to offer that maybe an academic might not to students? So that is a common thread I think you'll see in my work.
Okay, well, I encourage the New York Shakespeare audience to definitely visit Scott's website, kaisershakespeare.com, Kaiser Shakespeare.com, and check out the wide array of titles that Scott has under his belt. And then you can visit, as he mentioned, his Amazon.com author page, Scott Kaiser, if you want to purchase any of those titles, and you should, because they're real gems in that collection. So, Scott, I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me today and to tell us all about your long and storied career with Shakespeare. Do you see, as we bring the conversation to a close, what do you see coming up in the world of Shakespeare in the year or years ahead, either in terms of your own future writings or in terms of things that you think actors, students should be preparing or looking out for?
Well, in my own writing, I'm actually writing a memoir because I'm one of the few people I know. It's a very small club that have done the entire canon. So I'm actually writing a memoir that explores my experience with the entire canon. Um, and so that's what's next on my list. I also have a novel that I'm writing simultaneously. So that's happening as well. In terms of Shakespeare, I think you probably know that this is a very, very tough time for the American theater. And Shakespeare festivals are folding or shrinking. We Cal Shakes in Northern in the Bay Area is basically shuttered for a year, maybe more. Oregon Shakespeare here has shrunk and is trying to grow back. So all over the country, people are trying to figure out, how can we stay afloat? And I think it's going to have an enormous impact on the way Shakespeare is produced, the kind of plays that are produced. I think for a while we won't see the obscure ones, or if we do see the obscure ones, Coriolanus, Titus Andronicus, Timon of Athens, Two Noble Kinsmen, there'll be small cast. I think it's the crisis in theater right now is going to have an enormous effect on how Shakespeare is produced, at least for the next 5 years.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And we see that here in New York City. Many of the festivals, many of the smaller theaters that were the home to some of the smaller groups, some of the burgeoning performers have started to shut down, unfortunately, due to economic circumstances and whatever else. So, absolutely, something I always say at the conclusion of our episodes is support your local Shakespeare, whatever that means, whether it's going out and seeing shows, supporting authors, checking out film screening, listening to podcasts, whatever it is. And I encourage the New York Shakespeare audience definitely support Scott Kaiser all the way over in Oregon with all of his wonderful projects, all the books under his collection, and everything else, all of his great output. Visit KaiserShakespeare.com for all that information. And of course, support your local Shakespeare, whether that is all the way in Oregon or here in New York City. And whether you are connecting with us on social media or wherever else, you can find New York Shakespeare on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, WordPress, and elsewhere. Connect with us, follow us, friend us, poke us. Sounds scandalous. Poke us and just connect with us across social media for the latest happenings. And Scott, I thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. I hope the audience comes and checks you out. New York Shakespeare audience, thank you. Have a great night, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.